Uncle Howdy is successful in his WWE in-ring debut as he defeated Chad Gable in the main event of this week's edition of WWE Raw. And the question is, where do they now go from here? Where does Chad Gable go from here? But let's start with Uncle Howdy, because it was going to, as we said, when the Wyatt Sicks debuted, it was going to be about what's going to happen once they get in the ring. And I think a lot of people would kind of judge, this whole entire story based off of that, even though I think it's very clear that it's not really necessarily a story that is just about what happens in the ring, right? There's a lot of storytelling and a lot of emotions outside of it, and I think we've certainly, learned now over the past, whatever it's been, month or so, they've kind of gone behind the curtain a bit, right? They're pulling out the depth of these characters and really trying to make everyone understand the motivations as to why the Wyatt Sicks are the Wyatt Sicks. And, you had the six-man tag team match a couple weeks ago. Now you have Uncle Howdy making his in-ring debut, which I thought was fine. Probably, you weren't going to go into this thinking this was going to be a five-star classic main event or anything like that, because that was not the intention. That's not the aim here. It's to build off the story that they have been building for a while now. Because remember, this all kind of started with the backstage attack, and Chad Gable was one of the victims. So you had to get to this match at some point. They got here, and Uncle Howdy, predictably, gets the win because I don't think you're going to have him lose. Bo Dallas' first time wrestling in, 5 years? And it comes right, here off the heels of the 1 year anniversary of Bray Wyatt's passing. So Uncle Howdy gets the win, and I think now it's going to be interesting to see, again, where we go from here. Like he talked about kind of in the promo, right? He's talking about how this just, this isn't just a reckoning, it's a purge. And he brought up kind of, cutting the head off the snake, which the snake here is not Jake Roberts, it is Chad Gable. And because we mentioned, that seemed to be sort of the first, kind of plot point, I guess you could say, from the start, is that the Wyatt Sicks were taking aim at people who were, disrespectful to their family, had kind of done those kind of things, right? Not good things to their family, because that's what this whole story is about. And so, yes, Uncle Howdy gets the win here. And, I know coming out of this, there are people, as we've talked about before, there's a hard stance. You either are going to be for this or you're not going to be for this. Yes, it is something that still feels a lot different than everything else that goes on this show. But it is something where you're seeing kind of the rotating mix, right? Some weeks you'll have certain things in that main event spot. Some weeks you'll have other things. Now remember, the third hour of Raw is usually the least viewed hour of Raw. So I don't think it's necessarily a surprise that, it's not Randy Orton and Gunther story in the main event here. It's not the Judgment Day and, Damian Priest and Rhea Ripley. They're kind of giving this opportunity, I think, each week to kind of rotate different things into this main event slot. And, we've said, too, when it comes to the Wyatt Sicks stuff, it's been pretty clear that I don't think they're going to just have every single week, have a huge presence on the show. And I think that's what keeps them feeling unique. And remember, we've said this too, right? Whether you are for or against this, all this is about is how the crowd reacts. And the crowd is still reacting big to everything that goes on with this group. And I think as long as that happens, WWE is going to be just fine continuing to try to find the next step with the story. And look, it is still a lot about the story. And I think that right now, they're still doing just fine. Like the story is still playing out. You're having sort of these, sort of vignettes where you're having the motivations come out, whether it's Bo Dallas, whether it's Uncle Howdy, whether it's other members of the group who we've kind of gotten a little bit more peeling back the curtain a little bit to understand the motivations behind these people. And so I think for that reason, I still am perfectly fine with this. And I think this is kind of a scenario where you have to understand it's going to be more about the story than it is the in-ring stuff, but it is wrestling, and you're going to have these matches. And, as long as you go into them, I think, understanding that this isn't about, necessarily having the greatest match. It's about telling the story of the Wyatt Sicks and what they are out to achieve. And I also know that when you see someone right here in Chad Gable, there are people questioning, what does this mean for Chad Gable? Because I've seen some people definitely say that, how does Chad Gable and the Creed brothers, how do they come back from this? How does American Made come back from, losing these matches to the Wyatt Sicks? And I don't think it's necessarily something where you can't just come back from it, right? I think that, yes, this is maybe a roadblock for some people who thought that Chad Gable, remember, at one point, we're going back, months ago, where it felt like Chad Gable was going to be the Intercontinental Champion. And he seems pretty far removed from that. He's still a prominent member of this, this story, but he is far removed from kind of that Intercontinental Championship picture. We also know he's not going to be, in one of these Intercontinental Championship, qualifying matches or anything like that. So I think that's where, we kind of look at this and see what's next for Gable and this stable, because it is one you feel like that has a lot of promise, but you wonder where do they go from here. I mean, you would expect probably things to continue now with the Wyatt Sicks, but I know that is something that people are talking about and trying to figure out what's next, not just for the Wyatt Sicks, but what's next for American Made and Chad Gable. But we will find out and see where it goes from here. But as always, I'm curious to know what you guys think about this Wyatt Sicks storyline. What did you think of Uncle Howdy's in-ring debut? Let me know, as always. But some other stuff on the show. And like I said earlier, it was not, I think, the most noteworthy edition of Raw. But sometimes when you get to that one right before the PLE, that's going to happen because you already have your matches set. You already know, what's next. And, when it comes to sort of the main stories for matches that are going to take place on Bash in Berlin, the World Championship match, Randy Orton and Gunther. Gunther was not here. They did kind of the short promo with him, talking about, being in Europe on a live event. And yes, he did my favorite phrase. You guys know he did say this great sport in his, 15-second promo or whatever it was. But just basically saying that, he's still focused on the task at hand, and that is beating Randy Orton, which you had Orton come out here and sort of kind of unusual, I feel like, in WWE these days, where someone cuts a promo and they don't get interrupted. There's nothing. Like, it just Randy Orton came out and talked for 7-8 minutes maybe. And that was that. But Orton really, continuing to drive home the idea that World Championship is what means the most to him, right? Gunther made it personal, but I like kind of the backstory here of Orton talking about how that was his first, world title win. It was that belt, and having his name engraved on that belt still means something to him. And that's sort of, his aim here as he takes aim at Gunther heading into Bash in Berlin. And, I think that, Orton is still someone that there is so much you can do with Randy Orton from sort of a story perspective, because you have all the history, right? And you think about, just like he brought up here, all the history with the world title and sort of pushing how much it means to him to get that 15th World Championship win, which, spoiler alert, you probably know who I'm picking in that match, and we'll do our Bash in Berlin predictions on Wednesday. But I still think, it's one where you've got to have that motivation set, because it may not just be about what's going to happen in this match with Orton and Gunther. It may be about what's going to happen for Orton after this match, which we all know is going to at some point lead to that long-anticipated feud with Cody Rhodes, probably for the WWE Championship. So at least they've kind of put that in place here. But, Orton continuing to further this thing, heading into it, and, making his aim clear that is what he wants. And he is feeling like, Gunther has sort of met his match here, and we'll find out if that happens at Bash in Berlin. Another match on the card, CM Punk and Drew McIntyre in the strap match. It is official now, and you had the strap back involved here. Now, the one thing that was interesting about this was, yes, you had Drew McIntyre come out, and, he's talking about Punk and basically calling the fans enablers, because every time they chant Punk's name, it gives Punk a chance to do something bad, right? And McIntyre's like, you did something bad by challenging me to a strap match and thinking you're actually going to win, when McIntyre, all but says that he's going to destroy Punk here, and, brings up the bracelet again. As soon as he holds up the bracelet, Punk comes out, and Punk did exactly what McIntyre said he was going to do, because McIntyre mentioned, that Punk had to be scared of him, because otherwise, why would he be attacking him from behind? And Punk did attack him from behind, which, maybe you can kind of pick apart a little bit and say, that's, maybe not something he should have done, but he did. He did it anyways. And so, Punk attacks Drew McIntyre from behind with the strap. You have the officials try to break it up. Punk takes out some of his frustration on the officials. Adam Pearce, still the toughest job in America, as, he tries to contain all of these things that happen on WWE Raw on a weekly basis. But, again, I didn't think this was necessarily a lot to further things, but the match is set. You know what you're going to get. There's really not a lot more you need to do. These two have been feuding for months and months and months now, and we know this is where that physicality, the violence is going to escalate in a match like this, because it's not just your standard one-on-one match with a special guest referee or anything like that. It is a strap match, and there's going to be bruises, there's going to be welts, and, that's kind of what you set up here to make sure it's very clear that these two still want to beat the hell out of each other, and they're going to do just that in Berlin. So, not a lot to further the story in any way, but you did what you had to do here to get you one step closer to the match on Saturday. The other match that we know is going to take place on the Berlin card is the Terror Twins, Damian Priest and Rhea Ripley, against the Judgment Day, and you had another kind of scenario here where the Judgment Day, comes out feeling very confident about themselves. We knew they had to get the revenge. They did that, and they came out feeling confident about it. But, yet again, you have Damian Priest and Rhea Ripley responding in a big way and, kind of bringing up the fact that, Judgment Day calling them the bad guys, and Priest is like, you're damn right, we are the bad guys. That's what we've always been. And so kind of furthering that, these aren't just all of a sudden Damian Priest and Rhea Ripley just turn into the 100% clean-cut baby faces by any means. They're still, acting like badasses because that's what they've always been. So I think that's important to the story too. But, all setting up the mixed tag team match in Berlin, Priest and Rhea against Dominic and Liv. And, you had Rey Mysterio, Dragon Lee getting involved to set up that 8-man tag earlier in the night. But, Dragon Lee is going to be involved in something else, which we'll talk about here in a minute with Dominic. But, again, just kind of your standard stuff here to move it forward and kind of keep that tension high leading into the mixed tag team match at Bash in Berlin. All right, we'll get to the Intercontinental Championship tournament where you had 2 people advance. It was Jey Uso advancing and Pete Dunne as well, as those 2 are going to move on in this Intercontinental number 1 contenders tournament. And, no surprise, I think, to see Jey advance. I think we all knew that was going to happen, kind of setting the story in motion last week with Sami Zayn out of the picture for now, and Sami kind of giving him his blessing to try to go after that title against Braun Breaker. And, he had Breaker respond to both of those guys here, but Breaker just doing this thing. Like, you kidding me? Jey Uso or Pete Dunne, they're not going to beat me. So, we had that, but Jey advancing, Pete Dunne advancing. I don't know, it may have been a little bit of a surprise to people. You had him in there with The Miz and Xavier Woods. You could have figured, maybe story-wise, they could have had one of those advance, tie, one of those guys maybe into, their ongoing stories too. Because remember, everybody on Raw's got a story, and that's kind of what I like. Is even if it's not the top thing going, everyone kind of has a purpose. But Pete Dunne advances, and so that will be interesting to see, who else is going to join these 2, because you'll have the other 2 matches next week, because we know it's going to be a fatal 4-way, to determine who is the number 1 contender. Jay's in there, Pete Dunne's in there, and then next week you're going to have 2 other matches. It's going to be Sheamus versus Bronson Reed versus Ludwig Kaiser, and it's going to be Ilya Dragunov versus Dragon Lee versus Dominic. So those are your other 2 matches. I had to look. I was like, I'm trying to remember off the top of my head who exactly and what combination are in these matches, but that's your setup next week. So, you can try to make your predictions there, although these seem a little bit harder to predict maybe than these first 2. We knew Jey was going to advance, but very curious. I think Dragunov probably, has a good chance to advance in that one just because he has, kind of that backstory with, Braun Breaker, and you can kind of take Dragon Lee and Dominic out of the mix because of their story with each other. And then you've got Sheamus versus Reed versus Kaiser, which I think is a very interesting match. You could see them putting, Sheamus in there to kind of combo with Dunne since they've had something going on. But you could also see Kaiser getting an opportunity. Reed, we'll get to in a second. He may have other things to worry about because Big Bronson Reed figured, you know what, instead of just doing the tsunami 15 times out there in the ring, let me go do it on top of a car to Braun Strowman. Because this man climbs up on the barricade, the wall out there in the parking lot, and he decides to send a tsunami right on to Braun Strowman on this car. And he had kind of the little exploding windshield and all this stuff. But, you knew that they had to do something big for this, right? They had to do something that would kind of, catch your attention and get people talking. It wasn't going to necessarily happen in the ring unless they did the old Brock Lesnar Big Show thing where you had to have the ring explode basically and everything goes down. But you had them go out to the parking lot. Reed puts Strowman through the car. And here's what I thought was very good about how they pushed this. Officials are checking on Strowman afterwards, right? Because he took, the impact here as being the one who just had this huge man jump on top of him from this wall. But commentary mentioned Bronson Reed just got up and walked away. He didn't want any medical attention. He didn't want any of that. This is just a badass. He just got up and walked away. He doesn't care about anything else, right? And so they're continuing to push the idea that this guy is just indestructible, and he takes out this huge guy in Braun Strowman. And so now I think it's interesting to have Reed added to the mix here in this Intercontinental Championship tournament. I mean, come on. If you could give me Braun Breaker versus Bronson Reed, I'm all in on it. But you do wonder if Strowman is going to be the person who maybe comes back next week, or someone else, right? Because, Reed's got plenty of enemies at this point. He's got Seth Rollins, The Miz, R-Truth, Strowman. Could any of them get involved next week to keep Reed from advancing in that thing? Because, and I think that's why we always say, why are you doing triple threat matches? Why do you do, fatal 4-ways, that kind of stuff? Because you're setting it up because you don't necessarily want somebody to get pinned. And, this is kind of a formula where you can do that, especially in a triple threat setting. At this point, I'm like, if you're going to go Bronson Reed all the way, he's got to win that title because he has just been a force to be reckoned with. I don't think that's going to happen, but at least it is pretty interesting, and you're going to have a hard-hitting match next week with Sheamus, Reed, and Kaiser. So really looking forward to those two triple threat matches in this Intercontinental Championship tournament, and I think Reed, once again, is just he's becoming a star of this show. He's a must-see attraction at this point, and each time, they've got to come up with something to sort of up the ante here to make it even more exciting. But elsewhere on Raw, the only other notable stuff you did have, Zelina Vega made her return. That's going to set up a match with Shayna Baszler coming up next week, which allowed Damage to Control to get the win over Pure Fusion Collective here. So we know that's in motion. Again, everything else was really just kind of pointing you towards the PLE with that sort of stuff. And I think the biggest thing at this point, you did hear from Alpha Fire and Isla Dawn here, kind of pushing that Jade and Bianca are getting all the attention, but they're still the champions. So I kind of like the way they approach that because they're right. They're kind of the afterthoughts here, but they're the ones with the belts. But I don't know how long that's going to last because we'll have our predictions on that on Wednesday. But that was this week's Raw. Like I said, I don't think there was anything that really just, is going to come just blow you away here, but it is kind of your thing before the big show, right? And you're just kind of keeping your stories consistent heading into it, and that's really all you need to do, I think, on this show. But I'm curious to know what you guys thought of this week's edition of WWE Raw. Let me know, as always, in the comments. Always appreciate your feedback. Be sure to subscribe button, hit the like button on your way out, and we will have predictions coming up for Bash in Berlin. Also notable, the passing of Sid Vicious, and they did have the tribute video here on this week's edition of Raw for that. I was a huge Sid fan. This guy had a presence that just could not be matched anywhere he went, whether it was WCW, WWE, just an unbelievable kind of star power in the history of professional wrestling. Sid was one of a kind, and that kind of leads me into definitely wanting to do more of the retro type stuff here on the channel. So if you guys are interested in it, let me know. We can go back, look at some old shows, like old storylines, that kind of stuff. I've got some ideas, and I think we're going to do that here soon enough. But appreciate you guys watching as always. Let me know your thoughts on this week's edition of WWE